In the driest, most punishing stretch of desert in all of China, where summer temperatures scorch the sand and almost nothing survives for long, archaeologists dug into the earth and found something that, by every reasonable expectation of how ancient trade and migration worked, simply should not have existed. Bodies, hundreds of them, buried in boats, not near any ocean, not near any river large enough to sail. Small wooden boats, wrapped in cowhide, sitting in one of the most landlocked, waterless places on the entire planet, holding human remains so perfectly preserved by the desert's brutal dryness that researchers could still see the color of their hair, the weave of their clothing, and the individual stitching on garments sewn together roughly 4,000 years ago. For decades, everyone who studied these remains assumed they knew who these people were and where they came from. Then genetic scientists actually sequenced their DNA, and the results didn't just surprise researchers. They upended one of the most confident assumptions in the entire field, revealing something so genuinely strange that scientists are still working through exactly what it means. To understand why this discovery has generated so much sustained scientific fascination, you first need to understand exactly where these remains were found, because the location itself is central to the entire mystery. The Taklamakan Desert sits in the Tarim Basin in China's far northwestern Xinjiang region, and it holds the distinction of being both the largest desert in the entire country and the second largest shifting mobile desert anywhere on Earth. This isn't a mild, survivable stretch of sand. It's one of the most hostile environments on the planet, a place where temperatures swing between brutal summer heat and freezing winter cold, where water is scarce enough that entire stretches of the landscape remain essentially uninhabitable even today, with modern transportation and modern survival technology available. Recent geological research conducted by scientists at Lanzhou University, using drill core samples extracted directly from the desert floor, has determined that the modern, recognizable landscape of the Taklamakan began taking its current shape roughly 300,000 years ago, with the broader desertification process that eventually produced this landscape, stretching back even further to approximately 1.8 million years ago. This makes the Taklamakan considerably older than other major Chinese deserts, including the Badain-Jiran and Tengger deserts in Inner Mongolia, which emerged roughly 1.1 million and 900,000 years ago, respectively. In other words, this is ancient, punishing, remarkably stable desert terrain, not a landscape that shifted dramatically within any time frame relevant to human history. Whatever ended up buried within it stayed buried, protected by conditions that make the Taklamakan one of the most effective natural preservation environments anywhere on Earth. It was within this exact landscape, beginning with major excavations in the 1990s, that archaeologists uncovered what have since become known as the Tarim Basin mummies, a collection of hundreds of naturally mummified human remains, dated to roughly 4,000 years old, found buried in small, boat-shaped wooden coffins, each one wrapped in cowhide. The preservation quality of these remains is genuinely remarkable, and it's worth pausing to understand exactly how unusual this actually is within the broader field of archaeology. Most human remains this old, if they survive at all, exist as little more than fragmented bone, having long since lost any trace of soft tissue, hair, or clothing to millennia of decomposition. The Tarim Basin mummies are different. Thanks to the desert's extraordinarily low humidity and the specific burial conditions involved, these remains retained recognizable facial features, distinctly colored hair, and remarkably well-preserved clothing and burial artifacts, offering researchers a level of direct physical detail about Bronze Age human life that's almost never available from remains of this age anywhere else in the world. That level of preserved physical detail is precisely what sparked decades of scientific debate and speculation about who these people actually were. Because many of the mummies displayed features that looked distinctly different from the populations that have inhabited this region of Central Asia in more recent historical periods, researchers spent years constructing theories about distant migration. Given the mummies' physical appearance, their clothing styles, and certain elements of their burial practices, which seem to echo cultural traditions found in Europe, Siberia, and other distant regions, the dominant theoretical framework for a long time centered on the idea that these people must have been outsiders, migrants who had traveled enormous distances from somewhere considerably further west or north, eventually settling in this remote desert basin and bringing their distinctive appearance and cultural practices with them from wherever they had originally come from. This is exactly the assumption that modern genetic science eventually overturned, and the way it happened is worth understanding in detail, because the actual scientific process involved here represents a genuinely significant advancement in how researchers can now investigate ancient human population history. Researchers, in a study led by Christina Warrener, a professor of anthropology at Harvard University, and a research group leader at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, undertook a detailed genetic analysis of the preserved remains, extracting and sequencing ancient DNA directly from the mummified tissue itself. Ancient DNA analysis is a genuinely difficult scientific undertaking, since DNA degrades over time, and extracting a usable, reliable genetic sample from remains this old requires extraordinarily careful laboratory technique specifically designed to avoid contamination from modern DNA, while still successfully recovering enough authentic ancient genetic material to draw meaningful, statistically sound conclusions. When the results came back, they told a story completely different from what decades of speculation had assumed. Rather than confirming that these people had migrated in from some distant outside population, the genetic evidence revealed that the Tarim Basin mummies were, in fact, direct descendants of a small, deeply isolated local population, one that traced its genetic lineage back to what researchers call the ancient North Eurasian genetic lineage, a population group connected to the broader genetic landscape of Ice Age Asia. Crucially, this specific genetic lineage had largely disappeared from the broader genetic record found almost everywhere else across the rest of the world by the time these mummies were actually buried. In other words, rather than being recent arrivals bringing outside genetics into this desert basin, the people buried in these boats represented something closer to the opposite, a genetically distinct, remarkably isolated population that had apparently persisted in this specific region, largely undisturbed by outside genetic influence for an extraordinarily long stretch of time, holding onto an ancestral genetic signature that had essentially vanished everywhere else researchers have looked. This finding, on its own, would already represent a genuinely significant scientific surprise, overturning a long-standing assumption about migration and population movement in this specific region. But it's the second half of this discovery that creates the genuinely strange, seemingly contradictory puzzle that has captured such sustained scientific attention. Despite being genetically isolated to this degree, seemingly cut off from significant sustained genetic mixing with outside populations for a remarkably long period of time, these same people had clearly adopted a range of cultural practices and technologies that originated from populations located extraordinarily far away. Christina Werner herself, discussing the study's findings, specifically noted that the mummies were found in what she described as a highly unusual context, exhibiting diverse and far-flung cultural elements despite this genetic isolation. To understand exactly why this combination is so scientifically puzzling, it helps to walk through some of the specific cultural elements researchers identified. The mummies were found buried with evidence of wheat and dairy farming practices, agricultural technologies that did not originate locally within this specific desert region, but instead traced their origins to populations located thousands of miles away, in entirely different parts of the ancient world. Their clothing and certain burial practices similarly echoed cultural traditions and technologies more commonly associated with populations located in Siberia and other distant regions of Eurasia. Under normal circumstances, when archaeologists find this kind of cultural technology transfer, evidence that a population has adopted farming techniques, dietary practices, or textile traditions that clearly originated somewhere else entirely, the standard, expected explanation involves genuine population movement and mixing. People migrate, they intermarry, they exchange both genetic material and cultural knowledge simultaneously as part of the same broader process of contact and integration between different groups. This is how cultural technologies have spread across human history in the overwhelming majority of documented cases throughout the archaeological record. What makes the Tarim Basin mummies so genuinely unusual, and exactly why this particular combination of findings has generated such sustained scientific interest, is that the genetic evidence doesn't support this standard explanation at all. These people acquired sophisticated agricultural and cultural technologies from populations located remarkably far away, without the accompanying genetic evidence of substantial population mixing that would normally explain exactly how that kind of technology transfer actually occurred. In plain terms, they seem to have adopted the tools, the farming techniques, and certain cultural practices of distant populations, while remaining genetically isolated from those same populations, a combination that runs directly against the typical pattern researchers expect to find when studying ancient technology and cultural diffusion. This creates a genuinely open scientific puzzle that researchers are still actively working to fully explain. How exactly did a small, genetically isolated population, seemingly cut off from substantial outside genetic mixing for an extended period, end up adopting wheat farming, dairy production, and specific textile and burial technologies that originated among populations located thousands of miles away? Without the underlying genetic evidence typically associated with the kind of sustained cultural contact needed to transmit those exact technologies, several possible explanations remain under active consideration among researchers studying this question, though none has yet been definitively confirmed as the complete answer. It's possible that limited, small-scale contact with traveling traders or small groups of outside individuals was sufficient to transmit specific technologies and cultural knowledge without producing substantial, statistically detectable genetic mixing within the broader isolated population, since technology and cultural knowledge can, in principle, spread through even brief, limited human contact. without necessarily requiring large-scale sustained intermarriage between populations. It's also possible that this specific technology transfer occurred gradually, over an extended period involving multiple separate instances of limited contact, each contributing incrementally to the population's growing cultural and technological repertoire without any single dramatic migration event ever taking place. What makes this entire situation particularly compelling from a broader historical perspective is what it reveals about how ancient trade and cultural exchange networks likely operated across ancient Central Asia, considerably more broadly than just this one specific archaeological site. The Tarim Basin sits along what would later become known, in a considerably later historical period, as the Silk Road, the network of ancient trade routes eventually connecting China with Central Asia, the Middle East, and ultimately Europe. What the genetic evidence from these mummies suggests is that some form of technological and cultural exchange across this same broad geographic corridor was already happening considerably earlier than the more famous, formalized Silk Road trade networks that developed in later historical periods, and that this early exchange process operated in a genuinely unusual way, transmitting specific technologies and cultural practices across enormous distances, while somehow leaving remarkably little genetic trace of substantial population mixing behind. This finding connects to a broader, increasingly important theme within modern archaeological and genetic research more generally: the growing scientific recognition that cultural exchange and genetic exchange, while frequently connected throughout human history, don't always move together in the way researchers have traditionally assumed. For much of the 20th century, archaeologists commonly used the physical spread of specific technologies, tools, farming practices, or artistic styles across different regions as a fairly direct proxy for tracking actual population movement and migration, operating under the reasonable general assumption that new technologies typically arrived alongside new people. Modern ancient DNA analysis, applied across a growing number of archaeological sites worldwide, has increasingly revealed a more genuinely complicated picture, one where technologies and cultural practices can, in certain documented cases, spread considerably further and considerably faster than the underlying human populations that originally developed them, moving through networks of limited contact, trade, and cultural transmission that don't necessarily require the kind of large-scale population movement and genetic mixing that earlier generations of archaeologists commonly assumed. The Tarim Basin mummies represent one of the more striking, well-documented examples of exactly this pattern currently available in the archaeological record, precisely because the preservation quality of these specific remains allowed researchers to recover genuinely reliable ancient DNA, while the wealth of preserved clothing, burial artifacts, and other physical evidence provided such a clear, detailed picture of the specific cultural technologies these particular people had actually adopted. Without both of these elements present simultaneously, the genetic isolation on one hand, and the clear evidence of far-flung cultural technology adoption on the other, this particular puzzle simply wouldn't be visible to researchers in nearly as clear or as compelling a form. It's worth being direct and honest about exactly what remains genuinely unresolved in this story, because responsible scientific reporting requires acknowledging the boundaries of what's actually been definitively established versus what remains an active, ongoing area of research and continued investigation. The genetic isolation of this population and their clear adoption of distant agricultural and cultural technologies are both well-documented, peer-reviewed findings published through rigorous scientific research. What remains considerably less certain, and what continues to be actively studied and debated among researchers working on this specific question, is the precise mechanism by which this technology and cultural transfer actually occurred, given the apparent absence of the large-scale genetic mixing that would typically accompany this kind of extensive cultural exchange. This isn't a case of scientists being unable to explain a mystery at all. It's a case of scientists having successfully identified a genuinely unusual, unexpected pattern in the archaeological and genetic record, while continuing to work through exactly which specific historical and social mechanisms best explain how that pattern actually came to exist. There's a broader lesson embedded in this story that extends well beyond just this one specific archaeological site in northwestern China. And it's worth drawing out explicitly because it speaks to something genuinely important about how scientific understanding actually progresses over time. For decades, the dominant assumption about the Tarim Basin mummies that they represented distant migrants who had traveled into this desert basin from somewhere else wasn't held because researchers were being careless or unscientific. It was a reasonable, evidence-based inference given the physical appearance of the remains and the cultural elements found alongside them, constructed using the best available evidence and methodology at the time these initial assessments were made. It took the subsequent development of considerably more sophisticated ancient DNA sequencing technology that simply didn't exist or wasn't yet sufficiently advanced when these remains were first excavated back in the 1990s, to actually test that reasonable assumption directly against genuine genetic evidence, and to discover that the reality was considerably more complicated and considerably more scientifically interesting than the original, reasonable assumption had suggested. This pattern, an initial evidence-based assumption eventually being overturned or substantially complicated by newly developed scientific technology capable of testing that assumption in ways that simply weren't previously possible, represents a genuinely important and recurring theme across the broader history of archaeological and anthropological research. It's a reminder that even well-established, seemingly settled conclusions within any scientific field remain genuinely subject to revision whenever new technology or new methodology becomes available to test them more rigorously and more directly than was previously achievable. The Tarim Basin mummies, sitting silently in the Taklamakan Desert for roughly 4,000 years before their initial excavation, and then sitting in museum collections and research facilities for several additional decades before the genetic technology needed to properly investigate their true ancestry had finally been developed, represent a particularly striking example of exactly this broader pattern playing out in real time within the actual archaeological record. So, where does this leave our current understanding of who these people genuinely were, and how their remarkable, seemingly contradictory combination of deep genetic isolation and far-flung cultural technology adoption actually came to exist? The honest, current scientific answer involves both genuine, well-established knowledge and genuine, continuing uncertainty existing simultaneously side by side. We know, with real scientific confidence backed by rigorous, peer-reviewed genetic analysis, that these people were not distant migrants, but rather direct descendants of a long isolated local population, connected to an ancient, largely vanished Ice Age genetic lineage. We know with equal confidence that despite this striking genetic isolation, they had clearly adopted specific agricultural and cultural technologies, originating from populations located thousands of miles away. What we don't yet know, with the same degree of settled scientific certainty, is the precise historical and social mechanism that allowed this particular combination of genetic isolation alongside distant cultural technology adoption to actually occur, a genuinely open question that continues driving active research interest among archaeologists and geneticists studying this specific population in this specific region of ancient Central Asia. What makes this story worth returning to, beyond simply the inherent fascination of remarkably preserved 4,000-year-old human remains buried in boats deep within one of the world's most inhospitable deserts, is what it reveals about the genuine limits and the genuine ongoing progress of our current understanding of ancient human history. For a very long time, a landlocked desert basin holding boat-shaped burials seemed to demand an explanation involving distant migration, since the alternative, a genetically isolated local population, somehow acquiring technologies from populations located thousands of miles away, seemed considerably less intuitive, considerably harder to explain using the standard archaeological and historical frameworks available at the time. Modern genetic science, applied directly and rigorously to remains this well preserved, revealed a considerably stranger, considerably more scientifically interesting reality than that more intuitive original assumption. Beneath the sand of one of the driest, most punishing deserts on the entire planet, scientists found genuine evidence of a population that, by every conventional expectation about how ancient technology and culture typically spread across vast distances, simply shouldn't have existed in quite the form the genetic evidence now clearly shows they actually did.